Finally tonight, another of our conversations with authors of new books, and to Gwen Eiffel.
Christopher Curtis pulled off a literary twofer this year, winning both the prestigious John Newbery Award for Children's Books and the Coretta Scott King Award for Excellence by an African-American Writing for Children. The novel that has earned him such acclaim is Bud, Not Buddy. Set in the segregated Depression-era Midwest, the book introduces us to a 10-year-old orphan. The distinctive and instantly recognizable child's voice tells the story of the 10-year-old's search for a famous jazz musician whom he thinks is his father. A native of Flint, Michigan, Curtis is the first person to win both awards at once, and the first African-American man ever to win the Newbery. Christopher Curtis, welcome.
Thank you, Gwen.
This book is a novel, it's a work of fiction, but it's drawn in some ways from your own experiences, isn't it?
Right. Two of the main characters are based on my grandfathers. My father's father, Herman E. Curtis, was a big band leader back in the 1930s and had a band called Herman E. Curtis and the Dusky Devastators of the Depression.
Love that name.
Yeah, it's a great name. I even put 6 exclamation points after it in the book because I thought it was such a good name. And my mother's father, Earl Lewis, was a pitcher in the Negro baseball leagues, so I was able to bring both of them into the story.
So you managed to do all this, but the 10-year-old himself wasn't you.
No, not at all.
Not in any way. Your life was entirely different.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
The 10-year-old, I don't really know where he came from. Originally, I wanted to write a story from my grandfather's point of view when he was 10. But then when I started to write, this other voice came to me, the voice of Bud, of a 10-year-old orphan, and who was in a search for his father. And my grandfather remained an old man in the story, so I really don't know exactly where they came from.
Did you set out to write a children's book?
No, I think that it's important to tell a good story. I think that that would transcend age, really. And if you write a good story, everybody will read it. So I really want to tell a story. That's my main thing. And if children enjoy it, I think that's great.
But your background isn't in writing. At least it wasn't always in writing. What other things did you do?
My background was far away from writing. I worked in a factory for 13 years in Flint, putting doors on cars, which is really where I started writing.
An honorable profession.
Yes, a very honorable profession. During the breaks, I would write, and I found out that when I was writing, it made time go by very quickly for me. So I kind of served an apprenticeship of writing while I was in the factory. Then after that, I had jobs as maintenance man, campaign worker. I worked as a customer service representative, and finally worked in a warehouse.
So you worked in all these jobs, and all the time you thought you could be a writer?
I never really thought of myself as a writer or thought that I could write. I'd always been told that writing was a profession that didn't make much money, that the average writer in the United States made $5,000 a year. So that didn't seem too interesting to me. But my wife thought that I was a writer, and she one day said to me, "I know you hate your job. Why don't you take a year off work and see if you can write a book?"
How did your wife know so much about your writing?
Well, we had a long-distance relationship, and I used to write letters to her, and apparently they were very impressive because
she married you.
She married me and gave me the year off work.
How did you pick this language? You tell the story through an interesting kind of child speak, through the voice of a 10-year-old, and even when you're talking about very sobering things in the book, you tell it in this kind of innocent, wide-eyed way, the way children do. They don't overinterpret, they just state it. How did you develop that, including making up words as you went along?
That's really the most difficult part. I write and I don't know where my story is going to go. I don't know who the main character is going to be, but then a voice comes to me eventually. And I go through and write it in that person's voice. And then afterwards, since I write like that, I have to do a lot of editing and a lot of rewriting. So I spend a lot of time trying to corral the voice into that of a 10-year-old and changing things around. And I'm very fortunate to have the editor that I have, Wendy Lamb, is an excellent editor, so we work together on it to try to keep the 10-year-old voice real.
You have in the book, I'm going to ask you to read a little bit about it, a section in which you explained how you settled on this title, Bud Not Buddy.
Right.
His mother, this young child's mother, told him, you know, this is your name and don't let anybody else call you anything. Could you just read that section for us?
Sure. She'd tell me, especially don't ever let anyone call you Buddy. I may have some problems, but being stupid isn't one of them. I would have added that DY into the end of your name if I'd intended for it to be there. I knew what I was doing. Buddy is a dog's name, or a name for someone that's going to use on you if they're being false friendly. Your name is Bud, period. I'd say, "Okay, Mama." And she'd say every single time, "And do you know what a bud is?" I always answered, "Yes, Mama," but it was like she didn't hear me. She'd tell me anyway. A bud is a flower to be, a flower in waiting, waiting for just the right warmth and care to open up. It's a little fist of love waiting to unfold and be seen by the world, and that's you. I'd say, yes, Mama. I know she didn't mean anything by naming me after a flower, but it's sure not something I wouldn't tell everybody about.
It's truly spoken like a 10-year-old boy.
Right.
That leads us to one of the wonderful things you have running through the book is Bud Caldwell's rules, his full name, Bud Caldwell. Rules and things to have a funner life and make a better liar out of yourself. Number 83 is, if an adult tells you not to worry and you weren't worried before,
You better start because you're running late.
Now, this is a child who, when you listen to something like that, you would think this child is fraught with worry, but that's not really what you come away with in this book at all.
No, and I think Bud uses the rules really too. He has no structure to his life, and I think he's craving structure. And so the rules kind of are what he uses to deal with the world. He's found that when he deals with adults, that it's best not to have spend much time with them. So all the rules really lead him to keeping away from adults.
You have a segment in the book in which Bud, not Buddy, goes to the library, in which he spends a lot of time there right after he's run away from this orphanage, which sounds grim, but for some reason it doesn't come across as grim. I identify with that because I spent a lot of time in a library growing up. You as well?
Oh yeah, that was kind of my refuge, going to the library, and it always has been. I wrote this book and my first book in the library. For some reason, the energy seems to be right in there. It's always been a place I felt very comfortable.
Now, here's another interesting thing. This is a book about a little black boy, but it's not really about race. In fact, race seems to be mentioned only in a descriptive way, not at all as something as an engine that drives the book. Did you do that on purpose?
Yeah, because I think that there's a real misunderstanding of how black people see race in a lot of ways. And Bud didn't think of people in racial terms, really. He was in a pretty much segregated area, so he saw mostly black people. And it's the story of a 10-year-old boy. It's not the story of a 10-year-old boy and how he relates to the white world or how he relates to anybody. It's just his story and his way of trying to get along in the world.
It's also, but it's kind of full of lots of references to African American heritage, to the Pullman porters on the trains,
Right.
to the Negro baseball leagues, to jazz.
Right.
All of this, if I were a child reading it, I would want to know more about jazz, for instance.
I hope so. I hope that when I write things that have historical context, I think that the best thing that can happen with children is if they read it and then want to say, well, what really was that all about? And we'll go back and check up on the Depression and find out why there were thousands of children on the road and find out about jazz and find out about the Pullman porters. It's a big hope, but I hope that it reaches somebody.
Big hopes are important hopes. You have 2 children.
Yes.
Did they inform you in any way in your ability to tell this story?
My oldest son, Stephen, was a great help for me in the first book. He was my best reader, and he also...
And the title of the first
The
book was
Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963. He typed it for me. If I'd have any kind of problems, I'd go to him and he'd help me with it. My daughter, Sydney, is 8 years old, and her main contribution is there's a song in the book that Sydney actually wrote. So,
and she has the copyright for it.
She has the copyright, and it says used by permission of author. So she was really impressed when she saw that.
So you won 2 big literary awards, kind of blown you away, I imagine. How'd you react to that?
It was overwhelming. It still hasn't sunk in. I've been doing a lot of traveling and a lot of interviews since then, so I really haven't had a chance to go back and just kind of sit down and let it sink in. Every once in a while, I realize, like, I'll see a list of Newbery winners and Coretta Scott King winners, and I'll see my name on there, and it makes you kind of stop and say, wow.
Do children ask you questions after having read your book?
Lots of questions. I get the standard questions. How old are you? How much money do you make?
How much money do you make?
Oh, yeah, they always ask that. And questions about the books, things that they want to know, things about the civil rights movement. The Watsons is set in the 1960s. And then some of the time they'll ask questions about the Depression.
So you feel like the kids are taking away from these books what you intend?
Yeah, I do. I get that feeling, and it makes me feel very good.
Well, Christopher Paul Curtis, thanks for sharing it with us.
Thank you, Gwen.